Welcome to the Plain Talk Podcast. I'm your host, Rob Port. A little bit later in the show, Senator Kevin Cramer joins for his weekly segment, taking your questions. Remember, you can submit your questions to him whenever you like. Email them to rob@sayanythingblog.com. Also, I put up social media threads on Facebook and Twitter every day before I interview him. We usually interview him Wednesday, so if you watch for those, you can add your questions that way as well. But before we get to his interview, I want to go on a little bit of a rant here. Now, recently, the CEO of Wells Fargo, it's a gentleman by the name of Timothy Sloan, he appeared before a House committee. It's, in fact, the heads of a number of banks are going to be appearing before these committees. And the questioning from Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who needs no introduction to you, she's, people spend a lot of time talking about her, and sometimes I think maybe too much time talking about her. But during her questioning of Mr. Sloan, she took a shot at him that, well, it has some implications for North Dakota and our part of the country, and I wanted to talk about that a little bit. During her questioning, she asks him why Wells Fargo, the bank, shouldn't be responsible for leaks from the Dakota Access Pipeline. Now, remember, Wells Fargo was one of the financiers behind the Dakota Access Pipeline, and I guess that's her reasoning. Anyway, here's the questioning.
Hypothetically, if there was a leak from the Dakota Access Pipeline, why shouldn't Wells Fargo pay for the cleanup of it, since it paid for the construction of the pipeline itself?
Because we don't operate the pipeline. We provide financing to the company that's operating the pipeline. Our responsibility is to ensure that at the time that we make that loan, that customer, and we have a group of people in Wells Fargo, including an environmental oversight group headed by one of my colleagues who used to be at the EPA.
So one question, why did Wells Fargo finance this pipeline when it was widely seen to be environmentally unstable?
Again, the reason that we were one of the 17 or 19 banks that financed that is because our team reviewed the environmental impact, and we concluded that it was a risk that we were willing to take.
Thank you.
So essentially, she's asking, and that second question, the follow-up question, is what really got to me. She's essentially asking why Wells Fargo, when they knew that left-wing activists didn't like the pipeline, went ahead and financed it anyway. Now, I realize that's not the way she worded it. She said that if they knew that the pipeline was environmentally irresponsible, or however she said it, why did they finance it? But really, that's the left-wing position on the pipeline. Not everybody agrees with that position. That's an ideological position. It's politically, the left doesn't like the Dakota Access Pipeline, right? We here in North Dakota are familiar with the violent protests against it. That happened. They've made their point clear, but what she's making there is it's not really the usual argument we would have about something like a pipeline, right? The usual debate we have about something like a pipeline is, is it going to be safe? Is it being built in the right place? Do we have enough, oversight over it? Are we making sure all the welds are done appropriately? I mean, those are the sorts of conversations we normally have about a pipeline in years past. A modern debate we have about pipelines isn't whether or not they're going to be safe. It's basically the left just throwing mud against the wall to do whatever they can to stop the pipeline from being built at all. That's what's happening to the Line 3 pipeline in Minnesota right now. It's a replacement project by Enbridge that has been held up. It was held up by protests. It's been held up by former Governor Mark Dayton. It's being upheld by the current Governor Walz. And it's a political situation. And that's what Representative Ocasio-Cortez is doing here as well. She is making a political argument against this pipeline. She's essentially telling a privately owned bank, why did you finance a private project that politically people like me disagree with? Now that's important, and let me explain why. Because there is a movement in this country to use political cudgels, to use high-profile ideological martinets like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez to sort of strangle to death the things in society that they don't like. Whether it's boycott campaigns against, media personalities they don't like, and I realize there's one going on against Tucker Carlson right now, and believe me, I don't really like some of the things he said either. But is that really what we want? Is we're going to silence people by boycotting them? In the environmental field, right, we have what's called the divestment movement. And it's essentially where, left-wing activists use clout to pressure, like, investment funds and maybe pension funds and other sorts, maybe university endowment funds, those sorts of things, pressure them away from investing in things that politically they don't like, things like pipelines. And, it's been other things as well, but in this instance, pipelines. They don't like pipelines. They don't want to. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to cut off a source of capital for oil. And they're trying to produce a result whereby we leave the oil in the ground, right? Whereby we leave, we don't develop oil resources. We don't pump oil here in North Dakota. We don't provide all the revenue and the prosperity and the jobs and everything that oil development does here in North Dakota. We don't do that because of political pressure from people like Representative Ocasio-Cortez. This is a terrifying thing. This is why you've often heard me talk about how I don't like populism. Well, that's what this is. This is populism. This is the mob flexing their muscles. And you know what it makes me think of? Maybe you're familiar with the George Orwell book Animal Farm. You're probably familiar with the name, even if you haven't necessarily read it yourself. The book is an allegorical novel intended as a criticism of communism. Now, I'm not bringing this up because Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a self-proclaimed socialist or anything like that. I'm not trying to promote those connotations, but I do think that a lot of the political tactics that are in the book are interesting. And one of the interesting things, what Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and the divestment movement and a lot of these people who are trying to deplatform conservatives and to deny, industries that they don't like, capital, what it makes me think of are the sheep in Orwell's novel. Now the sheep are essentially, as some of the pigs are promoting communism and they're implementing, their base of support is the sheep. And the sheep use chants to sort of drown out anybody who's trying to make a counter argument or to drown out anybody who's trying to make a rebuttal. They're essentially the voice of blind conformity, right? It's the voice of we're going to get everybody to go along with it, and we're going to get everybody to go along with it by essentially shouting at them, right? That's the sheep. We're just going to they're the masses, and we're going to use them to sort of bully other people into going our way. Well, that's when I hear a sitting member of Congress, Representative Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, when I hear her sitting there and basically asking a bank, why did you do something that I disagree with? That's what I hear is the sheep. You stepped out of line. You did something that is against my ideology. Therefore, we're going to mau you to death. That's what I'm hearing. And it's terrifying. And again, it's the sort of thing that scares me about populism, because this is what populism is. This is majority rule. This is, the masses coming together and just shouting down the things that they don't like. And it doesn't really matter that we're all using oil. It doesn't matter that Representative Ocasio-Cortez is using oil every day of her life, maybe some of it even oil that flows through the Dakota Access Pipeline. None of that seems to matter. All that matters is that they have their ideology and they're going to enforce conformity to it. And the means they're going to use are things like, public pressure, which can be enormous. So anyway, I wrote more about it at Say Anything blog if you want to check that out. But it was a moment that jumped out at me about a project that was very important in North Dakota, a debate, very controversial debate we had about that pipeline here in North Dakota. And I just wanted to highlight it. Senator Kevin Cramer, up next. This episode of the Plain Talk Podcast is brought to you by Energy of North Dakota. Oil and natural gas from North Dakota strengthens all of America. And through our abundance of talents, innovations, and technologies, energy responsibly produced here translates to worldwide economic stability. With producers and our communities working together, we're securing a sustainable future that generation after generation can build on. It's all happening right now with Energy of North Dakota. Learn more at energyofnorthdakota.com. Senator Kevin Cramer joins me now, as he does every week. Remember, if you want to get your questions in ahead of time for his weekly appearances, you can email them anytime, rob@sayanythingblog.com. If it's 4 in the morning and you're still up for some reason and you think, boy, I would sure like Senator Cramer to weigh in on this, just email him, rob@sayanythingblog.com. You can do that anytime. Kevin, how you doing?
I'm doing well, thanks, Rob. How are you doing?
Well, pretty good. Busy as always. President Trump released his budget, and I'm not sure. It's weird. Some of these moments in the news cycle where we do things that are sort of like we still budget like a normal country does,
right?
Even though we don't anymore, and that's really frustrating.
Right.
But he released his budget. I don't know how meaningful it is in terms of what Congress is actually going to do. But what was your reaction to it when it came out?
Well, none of it was a big surprise, Rob. I mean, budgets by presidents are generally suggestions, right? They're 10-year plans. They sort of highlight a general map or direction it should go. There's a saying around here that the president proposes and the Congress disposes. So we require them by law to do it. This was due at the end of February, I think, but of course with the shutdown, everything was delayed a month, and so it's now, or maybe at the beginning of February. But anyway, it's an idea. I was thinking back to my 6 years in the House. I think every year that we brought Obama's budget to the floor for a vote, I don't think it ever got a single vote in the House. We brought a lot of budgets up: the Black Caucus budget, the Progressive Caucus budget, the Freedom Caucus budget, and at the end of the day, it's really Congress's budget that it works on together that becomes the budget, if in fact one becomes budget at all. We didn't pass one last year, so there were parts of it that I like. I mean, he wants to come down harder on things like fraud, waste, abuse, which we know there's plenty of in several budgets. He looks to balance it in 15 years. But if we don't deal with the mandatory side of the ledger, as you and I have talked about many times, we're not ever really going to get to balance. So it's a good place to start. It's a good discussion point. But Congress will be coming out with a Senate budget here, I think maybe late this week or sometime into next week. We're working on it right now. I'm on the budget committee. So, we're always open to suggestions for areas to cut and areas of economic growth that help with the revenue side. By the way, just so people know too, the Congressional Budget Office revised its 10-year outlook for revenue, increased revenue by $1.2 trillion here just recently, which you might recall this is a year after the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. So revenue is growing at a much faster rate than it would have otherwise. And so with $1.2 trillion more dollars, we pretty much have wiped out what the supposed cost would be of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act.
Speaking of President Obama's budget, I remember a lot of us complaining about, the explosion in the national debt, obviously annual budget deficits and then adding all of that getting added to the national debt. We complained about it a lot. President Trump complained about it a lot. He campaigned saying that we were going to reverse this. I was just reading an article where, based on his budget, and we all know that that's certainly not the last word for this budget cycle. But we're on pace under President Trump's tenure in office. We're on pace to increase the national debt by 50%. It's frustrating because, we complained about it under President Obama. We complained about it under Democrats. We complained about it under Republicans. It doesn't seem to matter who's in charge. We just keep spending. How are we going to bend the curve on this?
Yeah. So just to be clear, the curve is bent a little bit by the growing economy, and that's real. I mean, when we had last year, for example, real economic growth, GDP growth throughout the year of just right at 3%, that bends the debt curve by about $1.5 trillion. So that's part of it, but we can't get there without meaningful budget reform. So we're now approaching where 70% of the budget is on autopilot, mandatory spending. And the big reason, Rob, when we think back to like the Clinton the Clinton Gingrich years, as people like to refer to them sometimes, when we actually got to balance. The reason they were able to balance had nothing to do really with cutting spending. It had to do with revenue, and the revenue they were able to count against the budget was, of course, Social Security revenue was greater than the outlay. So it looked like it balanced because we had this trust fund that had a lot of money in it. Well, that's no longer the case because of the baby boomer is aging. Now Social Security is the other way around, and it's headed quickly toward insolvency. So our budget deficit, our debt is always until such time as we deal with Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. And I'm not talking about cuts to the programs. Even the president's budget, while it looks like it cuts Medicaid and Medicare, all it does really on the Medicare side, for example, the cuts in Medicare that they call cuts are because he's lowering drug prices by using the aggregate buying power, market power of Medicare. So bringing down the price of drugs for everybody actually saves money in Medicare. On the Medicaid side, a lot of it has to do with work requirements and reforms that don't actually cut people's benefits. It's just asking people that are able to, fulfill some other requirements, some work or volunteerism that are on the programs to do that. So it's not nearly as dire as it might look. But here's to the bottom line: if we don't deal with that mandatory side, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, but especially Social Security right now are they're going to be a weight on the balancing of our budget, plain and simply. And I know I say it over and over, but I'm open to all kinds of ideas and suggestions and discussions, and most people don't want to talk about it in politics because talking about Social Security and Medicare generally gets politicians in hot water. I'm willing to be in the hot water as long as people are having an open, honest discussion about it.
Speaking of it, and I feel like this segue is going to illustrate why we struggle so much with the national debt, because we just got done talking about deficits and debt, but now I'm going to talk about President Trump and ag spending in his budget. The Farmers Union, for instance, the National Farmers Union, criticized. They said, I quote, "It's time the president's policy proposals and rhetoric acknowledge the financial pain in farm country." Now, his plan would trim the USDA budget by billions of dollars. It would lower subsidies for crop insurance premiums to 48% from 62%. It would limit subsidies for growers who make less than $500,000 a year annually. All of this on top, I was just reading a report from the North Dakota Farm Bureau, where they're sort of, rating, the amount of lost trade from each state to China. North Dakota's at like 95%. I mean, we've lost 95% of our trade to China, according to this Farm Bureau report. Farm country's Trump country. I mean, we all know that from the 2016 election. We know that, frankly, from the midterm election. But it sure seems like some tough sledding right now for farm country. And, are these cuts, we just got done talking about the need to reduce deficits and debt. But, politically speaking, these cuts to farm programs, are you worried about them?
Sure I am. And this is why I've never completely supported a Trump budget. And this one won't be any different in that regard. We, again, always appreciate the guidance, the proposals from presidents. But at the end of the day, it's Congress's job to appropriate and to set budgets. The president's also supposed to set a budget, but we appropriate. So with regard to the farm cuts, just a few examples. And USDA, not all of that's agriculture, obviously. In fact, the vast majority of it's not agriculture. He does call for some work requirements for people that are on the nutritional assistance programs like SNAP. And if you're able and capable of working or going to school or getting some job skills that help in an economy that is short of a workforce right now, then, you have to work. Those things create savings, but it's not cut to people's benefits that actually need them. With regard to, for example, Rob, on the farm side, with regards to the cuts to crop insurance, for example, he's calling for a decrease or a greater share of the crop insurance premiums to be paid by the farmer and less by the government. Right now, the ratio is a little by the farmer, a lot by the government, especially if there's a claim, but it's for the premiums. Now is not a good time for that, for all the reasons that you've just stated. We're in a very down cycle and have been a pretty long down cycle of price support. The other area, though, that he wants to cut is the percentage that the crop insurance agents get from the federal government, the percentage, if you will, the commission. Well, the reason I oppose that, and I've opposed it in the past, Barack Obama tried to do this in an omnibus spending bill. A group of us, about 50 of us, got together, and we were no votes unless they promised to fix it, and we prevailed and they fixed it. And here's why this is important. Because crop insurance is one of the federal programs that is delivered in the private sector. The crop insurance agencies that deliver that do a great job of it. It's quite efficiently done. It's more market driven. And what happens is if you just keep cutting the share that they can earn selling the federal product, is you're just going to drive it to a single payer system, a single delivery system, which would be the government itself. We know that would be less efficient. So as well intentioned as probably those cuts might be in terms of getting closer to balance, it could have the exact perverse effect if we're not careful. But I want to reiterate something though, and that is that agriculture is a very, very, very small part of a third of the budget, which is that discretionary piece. We really have to tackle the mandatory side of this ledger if we're ever going to get to balance.
You have said, switching gears here, you have said that you will vote for, you will basically, you're supportive of President Trump declaring a national emergency. Your leader, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, came out this week. He said he is open to changing the president's national emergency powers as support grows within the GOP caucus for amending the National Emergencies Act. Now, when you and I have talked about this before, at first you were kind of on the fence. You said you looked at it. You felt like the president had the legal justification. But if I remember right, you said it was a separate debate whether or not he should have those powers. So that's what this is about, right? This is going back and saying, exactly what power should the president have? Are you open to this? Where are you at on this debate?
Yeah, so it's a great question because I really am open to this. This bill that we're talking about, a resolution we're talking about, is being offered or it's been introduced or being introduced by Mike Lee. And it does amend the Emergencies Act, the National Emergencies Act. So I think most people, Rob, at this point, while there were a lot of people early on who thought this was heading toward a constitutional crisis, I think have come to the realization that Congress at some point in the 1970s gave the president this authority, and then they amended it further in the 1980s to make it even easier for the president. And the original National Emergencies Act, just to give a little history lesson, what happened was the president was allowed to declare an emergency, and then the Congress could disapprove of it with a simple majority vote in the House and the Senate. In the 1980s, I think 1984, and I don't remember the exact issue that prompted this, they amended the National Emergency Act to say, and the president could veto a resolution of disapproval, in which case it'd have to go back to the House and the Senate for the 67 votes or 67% or two-thirds vote to override the veto. That shifted even more power away from Congress to the president. That's where it stands today, and as a result, there have been 58 national emergencies declared by previous presidents, and there are 31 on the books currently, 32 now with this most recent one. That's a lot of power in the hands of the executive. But here's what makes this even a little more unusual, and that is that we're dealing with an appropriation that we just passed that wasn't adequate in the president's mind, or a lot of us that want more money for border security. But we passed that appropriation, and now he's seeking more money through this National Emergencies Act. And some well-intentioned, principled conservatives feel like, the power of the purse lies with the Congress. It does. Starts with Congress. It does. And that the president should be able to use these emergencies to get more money after he just got the amount that he got, except that the president announced in advance, and he let Mitch McConnell, the Senate leader, announce in advance of the vote on the appropriations bill that the president was willing to sign it, and at the same time, and on the same day, he was going to declare a national emergency so that he could get more money another way. In other words, we are, as Congress, complicit in this national emergency declaration because we're the ones that appropriated an inadequate amount of money for border security, knowing full well what the president's intention was. All that said, separate matter to your point. I do like what Mike Lee's trying to do. I'm likely to become a co-sponsor of his bill. I like that it's separated from the debate today. In other words, I don't expect. I think at one point Mike's intention and others was that we would give principled Republicans a reason to vote against the resolution of support on the emergency declaration by giving them this other vote that they could cast. Well, I think they're two separate issues. I support what Mike Lee's trying to do, and I oppose what Nancy Pelosi is trying to do with her resolution of disapproval. So I'm a no vote on the resolution of disapproval. I'm likely going to support Mike Lee's bill when it gets time to bring it up.
Going to move on to some listener questions. This comes from Dustin. He says, does he give credence to the theory that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez is a plant or paid actress for a far-left group? And also, what does he make of her irrational, irresponsibly inaccurate comments on the Dakota Access Pipeline in her questioning to the Wells Fargo CEO the other day?
So I get the joke here on the first question. Let me further that by saying, no, I think she's a paid actress by the Republican Party and conservatives, because she is the gift. You thought Hillary Clinton was a gift that keeps on giving, and Nancy Pelosi was a gift. Well, those two people are the most reasonable Democrats in the world compared to this one. So she's I like to refer to her. I refer to her as Speaker Ocasio-Cortez because she has got the Democratic Party in knots. Now, I will say this, and I have to give credit to Speaker Pelosi. When Speaker Pelosi made her comments the other day, or maybe it was yesterday, that impeachment's not worth it, that it divides the country, that it's too divisive, it's time-consuming, energy-consuming, we ought to be about something other than impeachment. That was a very strong position for her to take. It was a courageous decision for her to take. I don't think her chairman of the committees are taking it to heart just yet. But this extremism that is represented in the person of Ocasio-Cortez is the clearest indication yet that we shouldn't let Democrats be in control of the House of Representatives.
Tim asks, he says, ask Cramer how he sees the switch to low sulfur diesel. And then he links to a Forbes article about trans-ocean shipping costs set to soar because I guess there's from an international organization, there's a new requirement going in that the ships use low sulfur diesel. So that's his question: is what do you make of this situation?
So I'm certainly not an expert on it, but there's an existing program that's been in existence, I think, for quite some time. That encourages some efficiencies in diesel efficiencies and use of diesel engines. They're here for an awful long time, near as I can tell. And again, I'm not an expert on it, but we just dropped a bill. I say we; it's in our committee that furthers that or extends that authority. Beyond that, I gotta admit, I don't know a heck of a lot about the issue.
Okay, I'll forward you his Forbes link that he sent in the article, and
sure,
you
sure.
can take a look at it.
Sure.
On Facebook, our old former state lawmaker Dwayne DeCray asks, Lisa Page supposedly testified that the DOJ ordered the FBI to stand down in the Clinton email scandal. When are the American people going to get justice for a weaponized federal government in the hands of the Obama administration?
So, yeah, good question. I think it's a matter of prioritizing over at the DOJ. Quite honestly, there's a lot of issues, obviously, for them to focus on. The Department of Justice, I've been quite critical, particularly under the previous Attorney General, has not gotten to a lot of these issues. They seem to be working more for the bureaucracy and for themselves than for anybody, than for justice. I'm pretty confident under the current leadership that people looking into all of this stuff, but I don't know, quite honestly, I don't know whether or not this particular issue is high on the priority list, whether they've done an investigation and disagree. But people deserve justice. I don't think there's any question that the notion that there's a two-tier justice system is frightening. I think to a lot of people, and understandably so. when we see both white-collar crime and violent crime going on, and some people that do very little get a lot of rough sentence and big fines, and then people who seem to do a lot more, particularly as it relates to our personal liberties, don't get anything. That's very unfortunate.
Patty asks on Facebook, the guy who said he would help get the kids that were kidnapped and taken to the reservation, what has he done? He said he would help. Chirp, chirp.
Sure. So, I don't know how much of this I want to go over. This is in relation to a couple of young girls whose mother left, I think it's the Fargo area, went to her reservation that she's a member of, and that's where the girls resided at this point. There was a custody dispute. I think the girl, and I don't want to go into a lot of details because I don't know that I know every detail, but the girls have, I think, they have a father, or maybe two different fathers in North Dakota, who by a North Dakota judge, a local or a county district judge, were given custody. But of course, reservations are sovereign areas. Tribes are sovereign in how they manage themselves or how they govern themselves. And at this point, there's been a standoff, a stalemate between our judicial system off of the reservation and the judicial system on the reservation. And we've been in touch with, and we're this week in touch with BIA, trying to learn if there's anything to learn, whether there's been a recent welfare check on those girls where they are, short of going on the reservation and taking them away, which I don't have the authority to do. And if North Dakota had the authority to do that, I suppose they would have, but they don't. And so it's a bit of a stalemate. It's very unfortunate, to say the least. Even this many details in a public forum is uncomfortable to talk about, but since the people involved talk a lot about it publicly, I'm fairly comfortable doing it to this degree. But we continue to monitor it, and we'd love to get those girls home. But again, it's not authority that we have to just go get them. We can talk and do from time to time with officials, but we don't have the authority to just bring them home.
Last question. Dane asks on Facebook, can anything be done to revise the Swamp Busters Act for farmers in the Devil's Lake Basin to drain their land better and get rid of wildlife easements?
Well, I'm working really hard, and it's one of my passions, Rob. I actually chair the subcommittee of the Environment and Public Works Committee that has jurisdiction over the Fish and Wildlife Service, particularly water. And I've been pounding away on it. I think we ought to get rid of permanent easements altogether myself. I just think things that were entered into 50, 60 years ago by somebody's great grandfather, without good mapping, without the type of technology we have today to do subsoil testing and determine really what a wetland is, where does a wetland end and begin. The fact that they've added buffer zones, you've really, what we've lost, Rob, I call it a regulatory taking. Even though the farmer still has their land, they don't have their land for the purposes that they, purchased it for, their family has it for, because the government, by virtue of regulations, is basically taking it from them. And so it's an issue that I'm working on very closely with people at Fish and Wildlife Service, and we're making incremental steps. But I will tell you this is one area, and we've talked a lot about this around my shop here. This is an area where North Dakota, while we're not maybe completely alone, we are unique because our farmers, over the course of the decades, didn't drain the way others did prior to Swamp Buster coming into existence. And so you have Swamp Buster, just to be clear, that's a USDA regulation. The Fish and Wildlife Service, that's another area altogether, but it's similar issues. The wildlife protection areas and easements that farmers sign up for, get paid some for, but the Fish and Wildlife Service easements are the ones that are the most egregious in my mind.
That's it, Kevin. Thanks for your time, as always.
My pleasure. And by the way, I just wanted to add one thing on the sulfur dioxide issue. I was referencing some legislation I signed on to that I'm looking at in the committee relating to diesel regulations, diesel efficiencies. The sulfur dioxide emissions issue specific to ships, and that is something I am looking closely to, because here's the problem. I think it goes into effect next year, if I remember right. And the ships issue, the maritime folks and some others I know, including unions, have approached Congress about it because of they're worried about the additional costs. And of course, additional costs to moving stuff adds cost to everything, including, by the way, including oil. Products from North Dakota. Yeah, oil
that we're shipping out. Other products from North Dakota. By the way, the United States set to become the #1 exporter of petroleum products in the world, passing Saudi Arabia for the first time since the 1950s. I think when Saudi Arabia first started exporting. So. That's a big deal. It may seem like an issue that's far away from North Dakota's borders, given that we're smack dab landlocked in the middle of the country. But a lot of the stuff we produce here goes to those ports and gets put on ships and shipped all over the world, which is a good thing. But we want to keep that process easy and flowing as possible.
And it's low cost. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, we produce a lot of great stuff, including some of the cleanest oil in the world. So, yeah. But everything in balance. Everything in balance.
For sure. Kevin, thanks for your time.
My pleasure. Thanks, Rob. Bye-bye.
That's it for today's Plain Talk podcast. Remember, new episodes come out Monday through Friday. Search for them on your favorite podcasting platform. Usually best to search for Plain Talk with Rob Port. There are some other podcasts out there with Plain Talk in the title, so that one should get you there. If you ever have any trouble getting subscribed to the podcast, email rob@sayanythingblog.com. I'm happy to help out. Any feedback for the show, any questions for our regular guests, send them there as well. Thanks for listening. We'll talk again.